I'm Riley Chen, 29 years old, and 3 days ago I answered a phone call that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. The voice on the other end was professional but firm. Miss Chen, this is Vincent Rodriguez from Desert Recovery Solutions. We need to discuss your outstanding balance of $47,000 on multiple Las Vegas hotel and casino accounts. My heart stopped. I'd never been to Vegas in my life. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. We have video surveillance of Madison Chen using cards registered to your address. She appears to be your identical twin. Madison isn't my twin. She's my younger sister, and apparently she's been living a double life using my identity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Scottsdale, Arizona, our house was the kind of place where neighbors stopped to admire the desert landscaping and perfectly maintained stucco exterior. My parents, Carol and David Chen, had built Chen's Auto Service from nothing after immigrating from Taiwan in their 20s. The shop occupied a corner lot on McDowell Road, and every evening Dad would come home with grease-stained hands and stories about the classic cars he'd worked on that day. Mom handled the books and customer service, her gentle demeanor masking a fierce determination to see our family succeed in America. The Arizona heat shaped our routines. Summer mornings meant racing to get errands done before the temperature soared past 110 degrees. Our backyard pool became the center of family life from April through October, though Madison and I used it differently. I'd float on a raft reading business magazines and coding tutorials while Madison perfected her Instagram poses and practiced the kind of poses she claimed were building her personal brand. Even at 15, she talked about becoming an influencer, insisting that social media fame was a legitimate career path that our traditional parents simply didn't understand. 6 years separated Madison and me, a gap that seemed to widen rather than narrow as we grew older. When I was learning to drive, she was just starting middle school. When I graduated high school and headed to Arizona State University for my marketing degree, she was navigating freshman year with a confidence I'd never possessed at that age. Madison had always been the prettier sister, the charming one who could talk her way out of trouble with a smile and a batting of her long eyelashes. She inherited Mom's delicate features and Dad's natural charisma, creating a combination that drew people to her like desert flowers to rare rainfall. My role in the family crystallized early and never changed. I was the responsible one, the planner, the backup parent when Mom and Dad worked late at the shop. By age 12, I was helping Madison with homework she found boring, making sure she had lunch money and clean clothes for school. Our parents worked 6 days a week building their business, leaving before dawn and returning after sunset during busy seasons. They trusted me to handle the afternoon responsibilities, and I took that trust seriously. The expectations placed on each of us reflected our designated roles perfectly. My report cards needed to show straight A's. Anything less prompted concerned conversations about my future and whether I was applying myself fully. Madison's C-plus average earned praise for doing her best and reassurances that not everyone was academic. When I made Dean's List at ASU, the celebration lasted exactly long enough for photos to be taken for the shop's Facebook page. When Madison barely graduated high school, the relief and pride from our parents felt more genuine and lasted weeks. College years allowed me to establish some independence while remaining close enough to help when needed. I chose a practical major, marketing, that would lead to stable employment and decent income. My part-time job at a local solar energy company turned into an internship, then a full-time position upon graduation. The clean energy sector in Arizona was booming, and I found myself drawn to the intersection of environmental responsibility and business growth. Within 3 years, I'd moved from entry-level marketing coordinator to senior account manager, building relationships with residential and commercial clients across the Phoenix metro area. Madison's path looked entirely different. She enrolled in community college but dropped out after one semester, claiming the classes were holding back her creative potential. Instead, she focused on building what she called her social media empire. Her Instagram account featured carefully curated shots of desert sunsets, trendy Scottsdale restaurants, and outfit photos that showcased her natural beauty and keen fashion sense. She gained a modest following, enough to occasionally receive free products from local boutiques and beauty brands, which she parlayed into claims of being a successful influencer entrepreneur. The financial dynamics of our family became more complex as Madison's lifestyle expanded beyond her actual income. Her influencer work generated maybe a few $100s monthly, not nearly enough to support the designer handbags, expensive skincare products, and frequent nights out in Old Town Scottsdale that filled her social media feeds. When questioned about her spending, she'd wave dismissively and mention brand partnerships and sponsored content deals that never seemed to translate into visible income. Our parents' reaction to Madison's choices revealed the different standards they held for each of us. When I bought my first car, a practical used Honda Civic, Dad inspected every detail and lectured me about the importance of not living beyond my means. When Madison showed up with a leased BMW convertible she claimed was essential for content creation, they worried aloud about the payments but ultimately helped her make them when she fell behind. The message was clear: I was expected to be financially responsible, while Madison's financial missteps were treated as temporary setbacks requiring family support. The first warning sign that something was seriously wrong came during a family barbecue last summer. We'd gathered in the backyard for Dad's birthday.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The desert sunset painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Madison arrived an hour late, slightly disheveled and unusually jumpy. Throughout the evening, her phone buzzed constantly with calls she declined to answer. When Mom asked about her recent Vegas trip, Madison's story kept changing. First, she'd gone with friends for a bachelorette party. Then it was a business trip for networking with other influencers. Finally, she claimed it was research for a sponsored post about luxury hotels. I noticed other inconsistencies that evening. Madison mentioned staying at the Bellagio, then later referenced the rooftop pool at a completely different hotel. She talked about winning money at blackjack, but seemed vague about which casino or how much. Most telling, she kept checking her phone with an expression of barely concealed panic. When she excused herself to take a call, I overheard fragments of a tense conversation about payment schedules and additional time. The pattern continued over the following months. Madison's Vegas trips became more frequent, sometimes every other weekend. She'd post glamorous photos from different luxury hotels, always dressed impeccably and surrounded by the kind of opulent settings that suggested serious money. Her explanations for these trips grew more elaborate and less believable. She was consulting for a Vegas-based marketing company. She was dating someone wealthy who flew her out regularly. She'd won a contest that included multiple hotel stays. Each story contradicted the last, but our parents seemed willing to accept whatever explanation she offered. Meanwhile, my own life was reaching new levels of stability and success. The solar company promoted me to marketing manager, complete with a significant salary increase and equity options. I moved from my small apartment to a modern complex in Tempe, with a view of the mountains and amenities I'd only dreamed about as a college student. For the first time, I had disposable income, and the freedom to make choices based on my preferences rather than financial constraints. The contrast between my growing success and Madison's mysterious lifestyle created an undercurrent of tension at family gatherings. When I mentioned my promotion, the conversation quickly shifted to Madison's latest Vegas adventure. When I bought new furniture for my apartment, Madison would arrive wearing a clearly expensive designer dress that cost more than my monthly rent. Our parents seemed uncomfortable with the disparity but never addressed it directly, instead making comments about how different people find success in different ways. The most unsettling moment came during Christmas dinner. Madison had just returned from what she claimed was a business conference in Las Vegas, though she couldn't provide any specific details about the conference topic or which company had sponsored her attendance. She was wearing jewelry I'd never seen before, including a tennis bracelet that caught the light with every movement. When Mom complimented it, Madison laughed and said it was a Christmas gift from a client, but her eyes didn't meet anyone's gaze. That evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, I found Madison's phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a text preview that made my stomach drop: payment overdue. Contact office immediately to avoid collections. Before I could process what I'd seen fully, Madison appeared and quickly grabbed the phone, her face flushing red. When I asked if everything was okay, she forced a bright smile and claimed it was just a billing error with her phone company. The incident haunted me for weeks. I began paying closer attention to Madison's behavior and story, looking for patterns or explanations that might ease my growing concern. What I found instead was a web of inconsistencies that painted a picture I wasn't ready to accept. Her social media posts showed expensive meals and luxury experiences happening far more frequently than any legitimate income could support. Her mood swings corresponded with mysterious phone calls she always took in private. Most troubling, she'd started asking indirect questions about my work benefits, credit score, and banking information under the guise of seeking career advice. The breaking point arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March. I was in my office reviewing quarterly marketing reports when my desk phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a Las Vegas area code, which I almost ignored, assuming it was a sales call. Something made me answer, perhaps intuition or simple curiosity about why anyone from Vegas would be calling my work number. Vincent Rodriguez's voice was professional but carried an undertone of frustration that suggested this wasn't his first attempt to reach someone about this matter. He introduced himself as a collections specialist with Desert Recovery Solutions, and immediately launched into details about outstanding debts linked to my name and address. The amounts he quoted seemed impossible, the kind of money that represented months of my salary. When I started to protest that there had been a mistake, he interrupted with information that made my heart race. According to his records, multiple Las Vegas establishments had extended credit to someone using my personal information, but security footage showed a young woman who closely resembled me making the charges. Hotel records indicated stays at the Bellagio, MGM Grand, and Caesars Palace spanning the past 8 months. Casino credit lines had been established using my social security number and employment information. Most damning, the woman in the surveillance footage had provided my home address and phone number when applying for these credit extensions. As Mr. Rodriguez described the evidence they'd collected, including detailed transaction logs and timestamps, I felt reality shifting beneath my feet. The dates he mentioned corresponded perfectly with Madison's unexplained Vegas trips. The hotels matched the backgrounds in her Instagram posts. The amounts charged aligned with the luxury lifestyles she'd been flaunting on social media. When he mentioned that the woman appeared to be in her early 20s with long dark hair and an athletic build, I knew with sickening certainty who was responsible. The conversation continued for 20 more minutes as Mr. Rodriguez outlined the legal implications and demanded immediate payment arrangements. He explained that identity theft cases involving family members were complex but that the evidence was overwhelming. The credit applications contained information only someone with intimate access to my personal documents could have known. Bank statements, employment verification, even my mother's maiden name, had been used to establish credibility with Vegas creditors. When I finally ended the call, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely hang up the phone. The office around me seemed to blur, as I tried to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. My sister hadn't just borrowed money, or made poor financial decisions. She had systematically stolen my identity, impersonated me to establish credit lines, and spent nearly $50,000 living a fantasy life, funded by my reputation and future financial security. The rest of that day passed in a haze of disbelief and growing anger. I left work early, claiming a family emergency that was more truthful than my boss could have imagined. During the drive home, fragments of conversations and incidents from the past year suddenly made horrible sense. Madison's questions about my job benefits weren't innocent curiosity, but intelligence gathering for her fraud scheme. Her defensive reactions when asked about her income weren't embarrassment but fear of discovery. Her frequent Vegas trips weren't mysterious business opportunities, but spending sprees funded by stolen credit. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at my laptop screen, afraid to check my credit report, but knowing I had no choice. When the report finally loaded, the damage was even worse than Mr. Rodriguez had indicated. 17 different accounts had been opened in my name over the past year, most showing maxed out balances and recent late payment notifications. My credit score had plummeted from excellent to poor, a destruction of financial reputation that had taken years to build and would take even longer to repair. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Madison had stolen my identity, forged my signature on countless documents, and created a house of cards built on my hard-earned credibility. The sister I'd protected and supported throughout our lives had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible, turning my love and trust into weapons against my own future. As I printed page after page of fraudulent accounts and unpaid balances, I realized that confronting Madison wasn't just necessary, it was the first step toward reclaiming my life from someone who had never deserved my loyalty. The weight of evidence sat heavy in my hands as I spread the printed credit reports across my dining table. Each page revealed another layer of Madison's deception, a systematic campaign of identity theft that spanned nearly a year. The Bellagio charges alone exceeded $12,000, covering luxury suite upgrades, spa treatments, and restaurant bills that could have fed a family for months. The MGM Grand showed similar patterns, with Madison apparently maintaining a regular presence at their high-limit poker tables and exclusive lounges. Sleep eluded me that night as I mentally reconstructed Madison's scheme. Every family gathering, every casual conversation where she'd asked about my work or finances, every moment she'd been in my apartment and could have photographed important documents. The pieces assembled themselves into a portrait of calculated betrayal that made my chest tight with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. This wasn't impulsive spending or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was premeditated fraud executed by someone who knew exactly how much damage she was inflicting. The next morning brought fresh humiliation when I called my bank to report the fraudulent accounts. The customer service representative's tone shifted from helpful to skeptical when I explained that my own sister had stolen my identity. She'd clearly handled similar cases before and walked me through the arduous process of filing police reports, disputing charges, and beginning the long journey toward credit repair. The irony wasn't lost on me that Madison's crimes would require me to essentially prosecute my own family member to clear my name. Thursday arrived with another call from Mr. Rodriguez, this time more insistent about immediate payment arrangements. He'd been in contact with several other Vegas establishments who were preparing to escalate their collection efforts. The Venetian was threatening legal action over unpaid marker debts totaling $8,000. Caesar's Palace had already turned their account over to a more aggressive collection agency. The timeline for resolving this mess was shrinking rapidly, and every day of delay would mean additional fees and legal complications. Armed with printouts, screenshots, and a determination I didn't entirely feel, I drove to Madison's apartment complex in central Phoenix. The Desert Ridge development catered to young professionals with its resort-style amenities and proximity to trendy shopping areas. Madison's unit faced the pool, and even from the parking lot I could see her BMW convertible in its assigned space. The sight of that car, which I now realized had probably been financed through fraudulent applications, filled me with fresh anger. Madison answered her door wearing designer athleisure that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her face shifted through several emotions when she saw me, settling on a forced brightness that didn't reach her eyes. She invited me in with the kind of casual warmth she'd always used to deflect serious conversations, offering iced tea and asking about work as if this were a normal sister visit. The apartment itself told the story of her deception, filled with luxury items and high-end electronics that her legitimate income could never have supported. I placed the credit reports on her glass coffee table without ceremony, watching her expression change as she recognized what they represented. The forced smile disappeared, replaced by the deer-in-headlights look of someone whose carefully constructed lies were crumbling in real time. She picked up the first page with trembling hands, scanning the details she already knew by heart, her face growing paler with each line item. When she finally looked up, Madison's defense was immediate and predictable. She claimed the charges were mistakes, billing errors that she'd been trying to resolve. The Vegas trips were legitimate business expenses for her influencer work. The hotels had upgraded her for free in exchange for social media promotion. Each explanation grew more desperate and less plausible as I stared at her silently, letting the weight of documented evidence speak louder than her frantic justifications. The breakthrough came when I mentioned the surveillance footage that Mr. Rodriguez had described. Madison's shoulders sagged as if an invisible support had been removed, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she couldn't meet my eyes. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of sisterly history and the fresh sting of ultimate betrayal. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, admitting that she'd been using my information for months, but insisting it was always meant to be temporary. Her explanation, when it finally came, painted a picture of escalating desperation and poor decisions compounding into disaster. The influencer lifestyle she'd been promoting on social media was entirely fabricated, funded initially by credit cards she'd opened in her own name. When those reached their limits and her minimal income couldn't support the minimum payments, she'd panicked and started using my information to maintain the illusion of success that had become central to her identity. Madison described the Vegas trips as escape fantasies that had spiraled out of control. What started as a weekend getaway funded by a small credit line had evolved into regular pilgrimages, where she could live the wealthy lifestyle she portrayed online. The casinos offered credit based on the excellent financial profile she'd built using my employment and banking information. Each trip was supposed to be the last one, the final indulgence before she figured out how to generate legitimate income to pay everything back. The psychological mechanics of her deception revealed themselves as she talked. Madison had convinced herself that she was borrowing rather than stealing, that my success obligated me to share the benefits, even if I didn't know I was sharing them. She painted herself as the victim of societal pressures to maintain appearances, trapped by the influencer economy that demanded constant displays of wealth and privilege. Her logic was twisted but internally consistent, a narrative that allowed her to sleep at night while systematically destroying my financial future. As Madison's confessions continued, I felt a strange detachment settling over me. This person sitting across from me looked like my sister, sounded like my sister, but the values and reasoning she was expressing belonged to a stranger. The Madison I'd grown up with, the little girl I'd helped with homework and driven to soccer practice, would never have justified stealing from family. Either I'd been blind to her true nature for years, or the pressure to maintain her fabricated lifestyle had fundamentally changed who she was. The conversation took an uglier turn when I outlined the legal and financial consequences of her actions. Madison's remorse quickly transformed into defensiveness, and then anger as the reality of her situation became clear. She accused me of being heartless and vindictive, suggesting that involving law enforcement would destroy our family for no good reason. The money would be paid back eventually, she insisted, once her influencer career took off and started generating real income. Her anger reached a crescendo when I mentioned that I'd already contacted the police and would be pressing charges unless she immediately began making arrangements to resolve the debts. Madison stood up abruptly, pacing around her living room like a caged animal, her voice rising as she accused me of trying to ruin her life out of jealousy and spite. She claimed I'd always resented her popularity and social success, that I was using this situation as an excuse to tear down everything she'd built. The irony of her accusations was breathtaking. Madison seemed genuinely convinced that she was the wronged party, that my decision to protect myself legally was somehow an attack on her rather than a consequence of her own criminal behavior. She painted her fraud as a victimless crime, pointing out that I made good money and could afford to help family members in need. The fact that she'd never asked for help, had instead stolen it through deception and forgery, seemed irrelevant to her twisted sense of justice. When Madison's initial anger burned itself out, a different kind of desperation emerged. She offered to sell her car, move to a cheaper apartment, take any job she could find to start paying back the money. The promises came rapidly, each more dramatic than the last, as she realized that her tears and tantrums weren't moving me the way they had our parents throughout our childhood. For the first time in our relationship, I wasn't rushing to fix her problems or absorb the consequences of her poor decisions. I explained that while I appreciated her sudden willingness to take responsibility, the damage had already been done. My credit was destroyed, collection agencies were circling, and the Vegas establishments were preparing legal action that wouldn't wait for her good intentions to translate into actual payments. The time for family solutions had passed when she chose to forge my signature and steal my identity, rather than ask for help or admit she was in financial trouble. The conversation ended with Madison making increasingly frantic promises and me gathering my printed evidence to leave. She followed me to the door, her voice breaking as she pleaded for more time, more chances, more opportunities to fix what she'd broken. The desperation in her eyes reminded me of the little girl who used to beg for one more story at bedtime, but I couldn't afford to be moved by nostalgia when my financial future hung in the balance. Driving away from Madison's apartment, I felt hollowed out, but strangely clear-headed. The confrontation had confirmed what the evidence already showed, but hearing her justifications and witnessing her complete inability to understand the magnitude of her betrayal had crystallized something important. This wasn't a problem I could solve through family loyalty or sisterly love. Madison had made choices that required legal consequences, and protecting myself meant accepting that our relationship might never recover. The next phase of damage control began immediately. I spent the following day on the phone with credit card companies, filing disputes and requesting fraud affidavits for each account Madison had opened.
The process was bureaucratic and exhausting, requiring me to repeatedly explain how my own sister had stolen my identity, while customer service representatives expressed varying degrees of sympathy and skepticism. Each call brought fresh indignities, as I discovered new aspects of Madison's scheme. She'd apparently been receiving replacement cards and statements at a mail forwarding service, ensuring that I never saw evidence of the accounts until the debts became serious enough to prompt collection calls. She'd memorized my social security number, mother's maiden name, and employment details well enough to pass basic security questions. The thoroughness of her preparation suggested months of planning rather than impulsive desperation. The most disturbing discovery came when I contacted my employer's Human Resources Department to verify what information might have been accessed without my knowledge. Madison had somehow obtained copies of my pay stubs and employment verification letters, documents that could only have come from my apartment or personal files. The realization that she'd been systematically gathering intelligence during family visits made every shared memory feel contaminated by her ulterior motives. By Friday afternoon, I'd filed police reports, contacted credit bureaus, and begun the complex process of proving that I was the victim, rather than the perpetrator of the fraud. The detective assigned to my case seemed familiar with family-based identity theft, warning me that prosecution would be complicated by our relationship, and Madison's likely claim that she had permission to use my information. Without clear evidence of her deception, like recorded confessions or witnesses to her admissions, building a criminal case would be challenging. The weekend brought an unexpected
call from my mother, who'd apparently been contacted by Madison about our confrontation. Mom's voice carried the familiar tone of maternal disappointment that had shaped so much of my childhood, suggesting that I was overreacting to what was essentially a family misunderstanding. Madison had painted herself as the victim of my vindictive anger, claiming that she'd only borrowed money she fully intended to repay once her business picked up. The conversation with Mom revealed how completely Madison had manipulated the narrative, positioning herself as a struggling entrepreneur who'd made some borrowing mistakes rather than a calculating fraudster who'd stolen tens of thousands of dollars. Mom suggested that family problems should be resolved within the family, that involving police and lawyers would only create more pain for everyone involved. The familiar pressure to prioritize family harmony over personal justice felt like another violation on top of Madison's original crimes. Dad's call came that evening, his approach more direct but equally misguided. He offered to help facilitate a payment plan that would allow Madison to gradually repay the debts while avoiding criminal charges. The suggestion was well-intentioned but completely divorced from reality, ignoring the fact that Madison had no legitimate income source and that the collection agencies wouldn't wait years for small monthly payments. His willingness to enable her irresponsibility while asking me to absorb the consequences felt like a continuation of the differential treatment that had shaped our entire family dynamic. The weekend ended with me feeling more isolated than ever, caught between Madison's criminal behavior and my parents' enabling response. The support I'd hoped for from family wasn't coming, leaving me to navigate the legal and financial consequences alone. The realization was painful but oddly liberating, forcing me to rely on my own judgment rather than seeking approval from people who'd consistently prioritized Madison's comfort over fairness or accountability. Monday morning brought another call from Mr. Rodriguez, this time with news that several Vegas establishments had decided to move forward with legal action despite my fraud reports. The civil lawsuits would name me as the defendant regardless of who had actually incurred the debts, forcing me to prove my innocence in multiple jurisdictions while dealing with the immediate financial consequences. The legal fees alone would be substantial, adding insult to the injury Madison had already inflicted. The scope of Madison's deception continued expanding as more details emerged. She'd apparently established relationships with casino hosts who'd extended additional credit based on her supposed wealth and regular play patterns. High-end retailers in Vegas had approved large purchases based on the excellent credit profile she'd built using my information. The web of fraudulent accounts and forged applications was more extensive than I'd initially realized, touching multiple industries and jurisdictions. Each new revelation reinforced the systematic nature of Madison's crimes and the impossibility of resolving them through family negotiations or gradual repayment plans. This wasn't a case of poor judgment or temporary desperation that could be fixed with good intentions and time. Madison had built an elaborate criminal enterprise using my identity as the foundation, and dismantling it would require legal intervention regardless of the personal cost to our family relationships. The emotional toll of processing Madison's betrayal while managing its practical consequences left me exhausted and questioning everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. The sister I'd protected and supported throughout our lives had repaid that devotion by stealing my identity and jeopardizing my financial future. The parents who'd taught me about honesty and responsibility were now asking me to prioritize family peace over justice and accountability. As the first week after my confrontation with Madison drew to a close, I realized that the person I'd been before her crimes was gone forever. The trusting sister who'd always put family first had been replaced by someone who understood that love without boundaries was just enabling, that loyalty without reciprocity was simply victimhood. Madison's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been clarifying, forcing me to choose between the family I'd imagined and the reality of who they actually were. The second week after discovering Madison's fraud brought a cascade of new complications that threatened to overwhelm my ability to manage the crisis. Tuesday morning started with a certified letter from a Las Vegas law firm representing the Wynn Casino, demanding immediate payment of $17,000 in marker debts that Madison had incurred using my identity. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the message was clear: pay immediately or face civil litigation that could result in wage garnishment and asset seizure. The irony of being sued for debts I'd never incurred while sitting in my modest Tempe apartment felt surreal. I'd worked systematically to build good credit, maintain stable employment, and live within my means, only to discover that my sister had been using my reputation as collateral for a fantasy lifestyle that was now collapsing onto my shoulders. Each new legal threat felt like another weight added to an already unbearable load, pushing me further away from the financial security I'd spent years building. My employer's human resources department requested a meeting after receiving several calls from collection agencies trying to verify my employment for garnishment proceedings. Sitting across from Janet Morrison, the HR director who'd processed my recent promotion, I felt the humiliation of explaining that my own sister had stolen my identity and was threatening my professional reputation. Janet was sympathetic but concerned about the company's liability if my wages became subject to legal proceedings, particularly since my role involved managing client relationships that required financial trustworthiness. The conversation with Janet revealed another dimension of Madison's impact on my life that I hadn't fully considered. My career in the solar energy industry depended heavily on client confidence and professional credibility. Large commercial accounts required their vendors to maintain excellent financial standing and ethical reputations. If Madison's crimes resulted in public legal proceedings or damaged my credit beyond repair, my ability to advance professionally could be permanently compromised. Wednesday brought an unexpected visit from Madison herself, who appeared at my apartment complex in tears, claiming that our parents had discovered the full extent of her Vegas activities and had threatened to cut off all contact unless she resolved the situation immediately. Her story emerged in fragments between sobs, painting a picture of family confrontation that had finally forced her to confront the magnitude of her deception. According to Madison, Mom had spent the previous evening calling relatives to warn them about potential fraud attempts, humiliated by the possibility that their daughter's crimes might become public knowledge in their tight-knit community. Madison's desperation had evolved since our last conversation, moving beyond simple pleas for forgiveness to elaborate proposals for making restitution. She'd contacted several escort services and sugar daddy websites, planning to use her looks and charm to generate quick income for debt repayment. The revelation that my sister was considering prostitution to pay back money she'd stolen using my identity added another layer of disgust to an already sickening situation. Her willingness to destroy herself rather than face legitimate consequences demonstrated how completely she'd lost touch with reality. The conversation revealed that Madison had been far from honest even during our confrontation at her apartment. The credit lines she'd established using my identity were only part of a broader scheme that included forged checks, unauthorized wire transfers, and cash advances that brought her total theft to nearly $70,000. She'd been feeding me partial truths while concealing the full scope of her criminal activity, apparently hoping that I'd discover her crimes gradually and therefore be less likely to pursue legal action. Madison's latest confession included details about accomplices who'd helped facilitate her fraud scheme. Tyler Brooks, her on and off boyfriend whom I'd met briefly at family gatherings, had apparently provided technical assistance with document forgery and identity verification. Several of Madison's friends from the Scottsdale party scene knew about her use of false identities and had even accompanied her on Vegas trips funded by stolen credit. The realization that multiple people had been aware of her crimes while I remained oblivious made me feel naive and exposed in ways that went beyond mere financial damage. The scope of Madison's deception extended into areas I'd never imagined possible. She'd been intercepting mail delivered to our parents' house, including credit card statements and legal documents that would have alerted me to the fraudulent accounts months earlier. Her technical sophistication surprised me, involving voice-changing software for phone calls to credit card companies and sophisticated photo editing skills for creating false identification documents. This wasn't the impulsive behavior of someone overwhelmed by circumstances, but the calculated methodology of a career criminal. Thursday's development came through another call from Mr. Rodriguez, who informed me that several collection agencies had been in contact with my employer, my landlord, and even my parents' auto shop, seeking information about my assets and income for potential seizure. The professional embarrassment of having colleagues and clients potentially discover my involvement in debt collection proceedings felt like another violation, proof that Madison's crimes were contaminating every aspect of my carefully constructed life. The call from my landlord later that afternoon confirmed my worst fears about the expanding impact of Madison's fraud. Several collection agencies had contacted the apartment management company, asking about lease terms and questioning whether I owned valuable assets that could be subject to legal claims. My landlord was understanding but concerned about potential complications that could affect the property's reputation or involve them in legal proceedings. The implication was clear: if the collection efforts escalated further, my housing situation could become unstable. Friday brought a family meeting that I'd been dreading since receiving my parents' increasingly frantic calls throughout the week. The gathering at our childhood home felt like a tribunal, with Mom, Dad, and Madison arrayed around the familiar kitchen table where we'd shared countless meals and conversations during happier times. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken accusations and competing narratives about whose fault the situation really was, and who bore responsibility for finding solutions. Mom opened the conversation with tears in her eyes, expressing her heartbreak over the conflict between her daughters and her desperation to find a resolution that would preserve family unity. Her approach was emotional rather than logical, focusing on the pain that criminal prosecution would cause Madison rather than the financial devastation Madison had inflicted on me. The familiar pattern of prioritizing Madison's feelings over consequences was evident from the first words spoken, setting the tone for everything that followed. Dad's contribution was more pragmatic but equally misguided, involving calculations about payment schedules and family financial resources that completely ignored the legal realities of identity theft prosecution. He'd apparently spent considerable time researching debt consolidation options and family loan possibilities, approaching Madison's crimes as if they were legitimate financial obligations that could be resolved through better budgeting and payment planning. His willingness to treat forgery and fraud as mere bookkeeping errors demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of both the legal situation and Madison's character. Madison herself had prepared for the meeting with a presentation that would have been impressive if it hadn't been built on lies and manipulation. She'd created detailed spreadsheets showing potential income sources, repayment timelines, and lifestyle changes that would theoretically allow her to gradually compensate me for the stolen money. The professional appearance of her materials couldn't disguise the fundamental flaw in her reasoning. She had no legitimate income source and had already proven herself incapable of honest financial behavior. The family meeting quickly devolved into familiar patterns of emotional manipulation and guilt-based persuasion that had characterized our household dynamics throughout our childhood. Madison alternated between tearful apologies and subtle accusations that my unwillingness to forgive was destroying our family's happiness. Mom reinforced these themes by suggesting that my insistence on legal consequences was disproportionate to Madison's crimes and motivated by sibling jealousy rather than genuine concern for justice. The breaking point came when Dad suggested that I should consider the impact of criminal prosecution on Madison's future employment prospects and marriage potential. His argument was that a criminal record would permanently damage her life chances, making it impossible for her to become a productive member of society who could eventually repay the stolen money. The suggestion that I should prioritize Madison's hypothetical future over my current financial crisis represented such a fundamental inversion of responsibility that I struggled to respond coherently.
Madison seized on Dad's argument to launch into a prepared speech about redemption and second chances that sounded like it had been copied from a religious website or self-help book. She claimed that prosecuting her would be an act of vindictive cruelty that would destroy her spirit and eliminate any possibility of genuine rehabilitation. The irony of someone who'd spent months systematically committing fraud while living a lie, suddenly discovering the value of honesty and personal growth, was apparently lost on everyone except me. The emotional manipulation reached its peak when Madison claimed that sending her to prison would be equivalent to murdering her, since she was too fragile and beautiful to survive incarceration among hardened criminals. The dramatic language and tearful delivery were perfectly calibrated to trigger our parents' protective instincts, painting her as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own destruction. Mom's immediate response of reaching across the table to comfort Madison while shooting accusatory glances at me confirmed the effectiveness of this strategy. My attempt to redirect the conversation toward practical realities met with resistance from every direction. When I mentioned the civil lawsuits already filed against me in Nevada, Dad dismissed them as scare tactics that would disappear once we demonstrated good faith efforts to resolve the debts. When I explained that my employer was concerned about the professional implications of ongoing collection activities, Mom suggested that I was exaggerating the situation to gain sympathy. Their determination to minimize the consequences of Madison's actions while maximizing the urgency of protecting her from accountability was breathtaking in its scope. The family dynamic that had shaped our entire childhood was crystallizing before my eyes with perfect clarity. Madison had always been the precious daughter whose mistakes required family protection, while I was the strong daughter who could handle whatever burdens needed to be carried. The fact that Madison's current mistakes involved criminal behavior that was actively destroying my life seemed irrelevant to the established pattern of family response. My parents were more concerned with preserving their image of Madison as a misguided child than acknowledging the reality of her transformation into a calculating criminal. The meeting's climax arrived when I finally lost patience with the circular discussions and presented my ultimatum clearly and without room for misinterpretation. I would continue cooperating with law enforcement to prosecute Madison's crimes regardless of family wishes or emotional appeals. The civil lawsuits would be defended based on evidence of identity theft, potentially resulting in Madison's criminal conviction if the facts supported prosecution. Any family member who continued enabling her behavior or pressuring me to drop charges would be cut off from contact until they demonstrated respect for my rights as a crime victim. The silence that followed my ultimatum was deafening, filled with shock that I'd finally drawn boundaries that couldn't be negotiated or manipulated away. Madison's immediate response was explosive anger, accusing me of being heartless and vindictive, claiming that I'd never loved her as a real sister should. Her fury at being held accountable for her own actions was genuine and revealing, demonstrating how completely she'd internalized the family dynamic that had protected her from consequences throughout our lives. Mom's reaction was equally telling, involving immediate attempts to mediate and compromise that treated Madison's criminal behavior as merely another sibling disagreement requiring parental intervention. Her suggestions included family counseling, gradual repayment plans, and various other solutions that ignored the fundamental issue of Madison's criminal liability and my rights as a victim. The assumption that family loyalty should override legal justice was so deeply ingrained that she seemed genuinely confused by my refusal to negotiate. Dad's response was the most disappointing, involving a cold analysis of potential family consequences that focused entirely on protecting Madison from prosecution rather than supporting my recovery from her crimes. He outlined scenarios where criminal charges could affect their business reputation, family relationships with extended relatives, and community, standing in ways that would harm everyone involved. His willingness to blame me for consequences that Madison had created through her own choices represented a complete abdication of parental responsibility and moral leadership. The meeting ended with me gathering my purse and walking toward the door while three voices called after me with increasingly desperate pleas and threats. Madison's final words as I left were particularly memorable, screaming that I was destroying our family out of selfishness and that she hoped I'd be satisfied when she ended up dead or in prison because of my vindictiveness. The melodramatic threat was clearly designed to trigger guilt and reverse my decision, but it only reinforced my conviction that criminal prosecution was the only appropriate response to her behavior. Driving away from my childhood home for what I suspected might be the last time, I felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation that was difficult to process. The family I'd thought I belonged to had revealed itself as a toxic system that prioritized image management over justice, enablement over accountability, and Madison's comfort over my fundamental rights. The loss was profound, but so was the clarity that came from finally understanding where I stood in their hierarchy of concerns. The weekend following the family meeting brought a new phase of harassment as my parents enlisted extended relatives and family friends in their campaign to pressure me into dropping charges against Madison. Aunts, uncles, and family friends called with emotional appeals about forgiveness, family unity, and the importance of protecting Madison from the harsh consequences of the criminal justice system. Each call required me to explain the situation again, defend my decision to seek legal remedies, and resist attempts to guilt me into sacrificing my financial future for family harmony. The most painful call came from my grandmother, who'd always been a source of wisdom and support throughout my childhood. Her voice was weak and confused as she pleaded with me to reconsider prosecuting Madison, explaining that family scandals would destroy her reputation in the senior community where she lived. The realization that Madison's crimes were now being used to manipulate an elderly woman into pressuring me for leniency felt like another violation, proof that no relationship was sacred enough to be protected from the contamination of Madison's choices. Monday morning brought news that would change the trajectory of the entire situation and force my family to confront realities they'd been desperately trying to avoid. Mr. Rodriguez called to inform me that federal authorities had opened an investigation into Madison's activities after discovering evidence of interstate fraud involving multiple victims beyond myself. Apparently, Madison's scheme had expanded far beyond family identity theft to include fraudulent credit applications using information stolen from friends, employers, and even strangers whose personal data she'd accessed through various means. The federal investigation revealed a level of criminal sophistication that shocked even me, despite my growing understanding of Madison's deceptive capabilities. She'd been operating fake social media profiles to gather personal information from potential victims, using public records databases to research target identities, and maintaining detailed spreadsheets tracking multiple fraudulent accounts across different states. The systematic nature of her crimes elevated them from family drama to serious federal offenses that could result in decades of prison time regardless of family wishes or emotional appeals. The phone call from Mom that evening carried a tone I'd never heard before, a combination of terror and disbelief as she processed the news that Madison was now facing federal charges that could destroy her life permanently. The family meeting that had ended with threats and ultimatums suddenly seemed quaint compared to the reality of federal prosecutors who cared nothing about family dynamics or emotional appeals. Madison's transformation from troubled daughter to federal criminal defendant had finally forced our parents to confront consequences that extended far beyond their ability to manage or control. The federal investigation moved with frightening speed once it gained momentum, unraveling Madison's criminal network faster than any of us could have anticipated. By Wednesday of that week, FBI agents had executed search warrants on Madison's apartment, Tyler Brooks' residence, and even our parents' home, looking for evidence of document forgery, identity theft materials, and financial records related to the interstate fraud scheme. Watching federal agents carry boxes of evidence from my childhood home while neighbors gathered to stare felt like the final collapse of everything our family had once represented in the community. The scope of Madison's criminal enterprise emerged through court documents that read like a thriller novel rather than the activities of someone I'd shared a bedroom with during family vacations. She'd been part of an organized identity theft ring that operated across Arizona, Nevada, and California, using stolen personal information to establish credit lines, open bank accounts, and make large purchases that were immediately resold for cash. Her role had evolved from occasional participant to key recruiter, using her social connections and natural charm to gather personal information from unsuspecting friends and acquaintances. The federal prosecutor assigned to Madison's case, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, contacted me directly to explain my role as both victim and potential witness in what had become a major financial crimes investigation. During our meeting at the downtown Phoenix federal courthouse, she outlined evidence that painted Madison as far more sophisticated and calculating than even I had realized. Bank surveillance footage showed her using multiple fake identities with practiced ease, switching between personas as she moved from one financial institution to another within the same day. The most disturbing revelation came when Agent Walsh showed me photographs of Madison's apartment that had been taken during the federal search. Hidden behind her bedroom closet was an elaborate document forgery operation, complete with high-end printers, laminating equipment, and templates for creating fake driver's licenses, social security cards, and employment verification letters. The professional quality of her setup suggested months of preparation and significant financial investment in criminal infrastructure that went far beyond impulsive bad decisions. Madison's arrest occurred on a Thursday morning while she was attempting to open another fraudulent credit account at a Scottsdale bank, apparently unaware that federal authorities had been tracking her activities for weeks. The arrest was captured on the bank's security cameras, showing her being handcuffed in front of other customers, while evidence of forged documents was seized from her designer handbag. The humiliation was public and permanent, destroying any remaining pretense that her crimes were private family matters that could be resolved through internal negotiations. The call from my mother that afternoon carried a level of hysteria I'd never experienced from her before, as she struggled to process the reality that her younger daughter was now in federal custody facing charges that could result in decades in prison. The fantasy of family-mediated solutions had finally collapsed under the weight of federal law enforcement, leaving Mom desperate for someone to blame for Madison's predicament. Her accusations against me for cooperating with authorities revealed how completely she'd lost touch with the basic facts of who was responsible for the situation. Dad's response was more measured, but equally misguided, involving immediate consultation with expensive criminal defense attorneys who specialized in federal financial crimes. His willingness to mortgage their retirement savings and the auto shop to fund Madison's legal defense demonstrated a continued commitment to enabling her irresponsible behavior, even as it escalated to federal criminal prosecution. The message was clear: Madison's crimes were still being treated as problems requiring family resources, rather than consequences requiring personal accountability. The preliminary hearing revealed details about Madison's criminal activities that shocked even the federal prosecutors who'd been investigating white-collar crime for years. She'd been using sophisticated social engineering techniques to gather personal information, including befriending elderly residents at assisted living facilities to obtain social security numbers and banking information from vulnerable victims. Her charm and apparent innocence had made her particularly effective at gaining the trust of people who never suspected they were being targeted for identity theft. Tyler Brooks's arrest the following week provided additional context about Madison's criminal network and her role within it. During his interrogation, he revealed that Madison had been the primary recruiter for their identity theft
operation, using her extensive social connections to identify potential victims and gather the personal information needed for fraudulent account creation. Her natural ability to make friends and inspire trust had made her invaluable to the criminal organization, earning her a larger share of the profits than typical new recruits would receive. The financial scope of Madison's crimes continued expanding as federal investigators traced her activities across multiple states and jurisdictions. Conservative estimates placed her total theft at over $200,000 from dozens of victims, ranging from family members and friends to complete strangers whose information she'd accessed through various means. The systematic nature of her crimes and the large number of victims made her case a priority for federal prosecutors seeking to send strong deterrent messages about identity theft consequences. My own involvement in the federal case required extensive cooperation with investigators who needed detailed information about Madison's access to my personal documents and her knowledge of family financial information. The process was emotionally exhausting, forcing me to relive every moment of trust and vulnerability that Madison had exploited for criminal purposes. Each interview revealed new dimensions of her betrayal, from photographing important documents during family visits to recording conversations where I discussed work benefits and financial planning. The impact on our parents' business became apparent when several long-term customers canceled service after learning about Madison's arrest and the family's connection to federal financial crimes. The reputation that Mom and Dad had spent decades building in the automotive community was being destroyed by association with their daughter's criminal activities. Their anger about these consequences was directed entirely at law enforcement and media coverage rather than at Madison, whose choices had created the situation in the first place. The civil lawsuits filed by Las Vegas establishments took on new dimensions once Madison's federal indictment became public record. The casinos and hotels now had clear evidence that they'd been defrauded by someone using stolen identity information, shifting their focus from debt collection to pursuing criminal restitution through the federal court system. The irony was that Madison's escalation to federal crimes had actually improved my legal position by providing definitive proof that I'd been the victim rather than the perpetrator of the fraudulent charges. Madison's first appearance in federal court was a sobering experience that finally forced our parents to confront the magnitude of her crimes and their likely consequences. Seeing their daughter in an orange jumpsuit, shackled and surrounded by federal marshals, shattered any remaining illusions about the seriousness of her situation. The federal judge's comments about the systematic nature of her crimes and their impact on multiple victims made clear that this wasn't a case where family connections or emotional appeals would influence sentencing decisions. The plea bargain negotiations revealed that federal prosecutors were seeking a sentence of 12 to 15 years in federal prison, reflecting both the scope of Madison's crimes and her leadership role in the identity theft organization. Her defense attorneys argued for leniency based on her age and lack of prior criminal history, but the evidence of sophisticated planning and multiple victims made meaningful sentence reduction unlikely. The reality that Madison would spend her 30s in federal prison finally penetrated the denial that had characterized our family's response to her criminal behavior. My parents' final attempt to pressure me into providing character testimony on Madison's behalf revealed how completely they'd failed to understand either the legal situation or my emotional state after months of betrayal and manipulation. Their assumption that family loyalty should override my role as a crime victim demonstrated a fundamental inability to process the transformation of their daughter from family member to federal criminal defendant. The request that I lie under oath to minimize Madison's culpability was the final proof that their moral compass had been completely corrupted by years of enabling her irresponsible behavior. The confrontation that ended my relationship with my parents occurred in the parking lot outside the federal courthouse after Madison's sentencing hearing, where she'd received 14 years in federal prison followed by 5 years of supervised release. Instead of accepting responsibility for their role in enabling Madison's criminal development, they blamed me for cooperating with federal authorities and refusing to provide false testimony that might have reduced her sentence. Their accusations that I'd destroyed our family out of vindictiveness revealed how completely they'd inverted the moral reality of the situation. Walking away from my parents that day required a level of emotional strength I hadn't known I possessed, but the alternative was accepting responsibility for crimes I hadn't committed and consequences I hadn't created. The family that had raised me no longer existed, replaced by enablers and manipulators who prioritized image management over justice and Madison's comfort over truth. The grief was profound, but so was the relief of finally escaping a toxic dynamic that had defined my entire life until that moment. The months following Madison's sentencing brought a gradual restoration of my financial stability and professional reputation as the federal case provided clear documentation of my victim status in the identity theft scheme. Credit reporting agencies removed fraudulent accounts from my records, collection agencies ceased their harassment, and my employer expressed support for my cooperation with federal law enforcement. The practical recovery was faster than I'd expected, though the emotional healing would take much longer. Therapy with Dr. Sarah Martinez became essential for processing the complex emotions surrounding Madison's crimes and our family's response to them. The sessions helped me understand how years of differential treatment and impossible expectations had created a dynamic where Madison learned that charm could substitute for accountability, while I learned that my value depended on solving other people's problems. Recognizing these patterns was the first step toward building healthier relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation and guilt. The support network that emerged during my recovery consisted primarily of friends and colleagues who'd been peripheral to my family-focused life but proved more loyal and trustworthy than the relatives who'd abandoned me when I needed them most. Jessica Thompson, my closest friend from work, became a constant source of encouragement and practical support, helping me navigate the legal complexities while maintaining perspective about my own worth and rights. The contrast between her unconditional support and my family's conditional love highlighted how toxic my original relationships had actually been. Rebuilding my life required conscious choices about boundaries and relationships that prioritized my emotional health over social expectations or family obligations. The decision to change my phone number, move to a different apartment complex, and establish new social media accounts felt like shedding an old skin that had been contaminated by years of manipulation and betrayal. Each step toward independence reinforced my growing understanding that love without respect was just another form of abuse. The financial recovery included pursuing civil restitution through the federal court system, which ultimately resulted in seizure of assets that Madison and her criminal associates had acquired through their identity theft activities. While the monetary recovery was significant, the more important victory was the official recognition that I'd been wronged and deserved compensation for the damages inflicted by someone who'd exploited family trust for criminal purposes.
The validation was more valuable than the money, confirming that my decision to seek legal justice had been morally correct despite family pressure to prioritize forgiveness over accountability. Madison's letters from federal prison arrived sporadically over the following year, each one following the same pattern of manipulation and guilt-based appeals that had characterized our relationship since childhood. She alternated between apologies and accusations, claiming remorse while simultaneously blaming me for her incarceration and the destruction of our family relationships. The letters revealed that even federal prison hadn't fundamentally changed her character or her belief that other people were responsible for the consequences of her choices. The decision to stop reading Madison's letters and return them unopened marked a crucial boundary in my recovery process, representing a final rejection of the guilt and obligation that had defined our relationship for decades. The realization that I didn't owe her forgiveness, communication, or emotional support simply because we shared DNA was liberating in ways that extended far beyond our specific situation. The same principle applied to my parents, whose continued attempts to blame me for Madison's choices revealed their own inability to accept reality or change their enabling behaviors. Professional opportunities that had been delayed or complicated by Madison's crimes began materializing as my reputation recovered and my emotional energy became available for career advancement rather than family crisis management. The promotion to senior marketing director came with responsibilities that required travel and creative thinking, both of which had been impossible during the months of legal proceedings and family conflict. The success felt sweeter because it was entirely my own, uncontaminated by family drama or obligatory sharing with people who didn't appreciate my achievements. The romantic relationship that developed with Marcus Rivera, a fellow solar energy professional I met at an industry conference, represented the first time I'd been able to focus on partnership based on mutual attraction and compatibility rather than family approval or social expectations. His background as someone who'd also had to establish boundaries with toxic family members created a foundation of understanding that would have been impossible with someone who hadn't experienced similar challenges. The relationship grew slowly and deliberately, built on honesty rather than the emotional manipulation that had characterized my family interactions. 2 years after Madison's sentencing, I received notification that she was eligible for early release due to cooperation with federal authorities in prosecuting other members of her identity theft network. The news prompted a range of emotions, from anxiety about potential renewed contact attempts to curiosity about whether prison had genuinely changed her character and values. The decision to maintain my boundaries regardless of her release status had been made long before, but implementing it would require ongoing vigilance and emotional strength. The life I'd built in Madison's absence was characterized by authentic relationships, professional success, and personal growth that would have been impossible while managing the constant crises and manipulations that had defined our family dynamic. Friends who supported my boundaries, colleagues who respected my expertise, and romantic partnerships based on equality rather than obligation created a social environment that reinforced positive choices rather than enabling destructive patterns. The contrast with my original family relationships was stark and illuminating. The final chapter of my relationship with Madison came through a chance encounter at a Phoenix shopping center 3 years after her federal conviction. She approached me hesitantly, apparently recognizing me despite my shorter haircut and updated wardrobe that reflected my improved financial situation and professional confidence. The conversation was brief and awkward, with Madison attempting to initiate small talk while I maintained polite but firm boundaries about not wanting renewed contact or relationship restoration. Her appearance had changed significantly during her incarceration, with the artificial glamour that had once defined her Instagram presence replaced by a more natural but worn look that reflected genuine hardship rather than manufactured drama. The charm that had once made her so effective at manipulation seemed diminished, either by prison experience or by recognition that it no longer worked on me. When she asked whether we could meet for coffee to discuss rebuilding our relationship, my refusal was calm but absolute, based on years of therapy and boundary development rather than immediate anger or hurt. The peace that followed that final encounter confirmed that my decision to prioritize my own healing over family reconciliation had been correct, despite years of social pressure to forgive and reconnect regardless of changed behavior or genuine accountability. Madison's crimes had been the catalyst for recognizing toxic patterns that extended far beyond her individual actions, encompassing family dynamics that had shaped my entire identity in unhealthy ways. The recovery process had been painful but ultimately liberating, teaching me that authentic relationships require mutual respect and that family status doesn't justify accepting abuse or manipulation. The transformation that occurred over the following 5 years reshaped every aspect of my existence in ways I never could have imagined during those dark months when Madison's crimes first came to light. The woman who had once structured her entire life around family obligations and the desperate need for approval had evolved into someone who understood that authentic happiness required the courage to disappoint people whose expectations were fundamentally unreasonable. The journey from victim to victor wasn't linear or easy, but each step forward reinforced the wisdom of choosing truth over comfort. Professional success accelerated once my emotional energy was no longer consumed by family crises and toxic relationship management. The solar energy industry in Arizona experienced explosive growth as environmental consciousness merged with economic incentives, creating opportunities for innovative marketing strategies that could reach both residential and commercial markets. My expertise in relationship building, honed through years of navigating complex family dynamics, translated surprisingly well into client management and strategic partnership development, though now it was based on mutual benefit rather than one-sided sacrifice. The promotion to regional marketing director came with responsibilities that spanned 3 southwestern states, requiring frequent travel and collaboration with diverse teams across multiple markets. The position offered everything I'd dreamed of during those college years when family obligations had forced me to limit my professional ambitions, intellectual challenge, financial reward, and the satisfaction of building something meaningful that extended beyond immediate family concerns. Each successful campaign and exceeded sales target felt like a small victory over the voice in my head that had once insisted my primary value lay in solving other people's problems. Marcus Rivera had entered my life at a renewable energy conference in Las Vegas, a location that initially triggered anxiety given its association with Madison's crimes but ultimately provided the perfect backdrop for reclaiming narrative control over my own experiences. His presentation on innovative financing models for commercial solar installations was brilliant and engaging, but what attracted me most was his obvious passion for work that created genuine value rather than merely generating profit. Our conversation over dinner revealed shared experiences with family boundaries and the challenge of building authentic identities separate from toxic relationship patterns. The relationship developed slowly and deliberately, a conscious choice to prioritize emotional compatibility over physical chemistry or social expectations. Marcus had also experienced the necessity of cutting contact with manipulative family members, in his case parents whose gambling addiction had led them to steal from his childhood college fund and forge his signature on multiple loan applications. Our shared understanding of betrayal trauma created a foundation of empathy that would have been impossible with someone who hadn't navigated similar challenges. We could discuss boundaries and emotional triggers without judgment or defensive explanations. Marriage to Marcus represented the first major life decision I'd made based entirely on personal happiness rather than family approval or social pressure. The ceremony was small and intimate, held in Sedona with red rock formations providing a dramatic backdrop for vows that emphasized partnership and mutual respect rather than traditional obligations and submission. The guest list included friends and colleagues who'd supported my journey toward independence, notably excluding family members whose presence would have contaminated the celebration with guilt and manipulation. The absence felt liberating rather than sad, proof that family of choice could be more meaningful than family of origin. The decision to start our own renewable energy consulting firm emerged naturally from our combined expertise and shared vision for business practices that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term profit maximization. Riley Chen Sustainable Solutions began operations from our home office in Scottsdale, focusing initially on helping small businesses implement cost-effective solar installations while navigating complex federal and state incentive programs. The work was challenging and rewarding, requiring technical knowledge, relationship skills, and creative problem-solving that utilized every aspect of my professional development. Building a business partnership with my spouse required constant communication and boundary maintenance that drew heavily on skills developed during therapy and family recovery. We established clear roles and responsibilities, regular check-ins about both business and personal concerns, and agreements about decision-making processes that respected both perspectives without defaulting to conflict avoidance or people-pleasing behaviors. The success of our professional collaboration strengthened our marriage by demonstrating that healthy relationships could accommodate disagreement and negotiation without descending into manipulation or emotional warfare. The first major test of our new business came when a potential client turned out to be connected to Tyler Brooks, Madison's former boyfriend and criminal accomplice who had been released from federal prison after serving a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against other members of their identity theft network. The discovery occurred during routine background checks that revealed the client's business partner was Tyler's cousin, creating potential complications that could have jeopardized our reputation or created uncomfortable personal encounters. The decision to decline the contract was difficult financially but necessary for maintaining the boundaries that protected our emotional well-being. News of Madison's early release from federal prison reached me through a certified letter from the Bureau of Prisons, a notification required by victim services programs to alert crime victims about changes in offender status. The letter included information about supervised release conditions that prohibited her from contacting victims without permission, along with contact information for reporting any violations of these restrictions. Reading the formal language that reduced our relationship to offender-victim terminology felt surreal but also validating, official recognition that Madison's crimes had created lasting consequences that extended beyond family dynamics. The anxiety that preceded Madison's release was manageable but persistent, manifesting in increased vigilance about personal security and heightened awareness of potential social media contact or indirect communication through mutual acquaintances. Therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez focused on maintaining perspective about realistic risks while acknowledging legitimate concerns about renewed manipulation attempts. The preparation was valuable, reinforcing coping strategies and boundary maintenance techniques that had become second nature but required conscious reinforcement during stressful periods. Madison's first attempt at contact came through a Facebook message sent from a profile that used a slightly altered version of her name, probably an attempt to circumvent social media blocking that I'd implemented years earlier. The message was carefully crafted to appear innocent and conciliatory, expressing regret about past behavior while requesting an opportunity to apologize in person and rebuild our relationship. The language was sophisticated and emotionally intelligent, suggesting either genuine personal growth or enhanced manipulation skills developed during incarceration. Either way, my response was immediate deletion and reporting the contact as harassment. The second contact attempt was more sophisticated, involving a letter delivered to our business address that had been obtained through public records research. The letter was longer and more detailed than the social media message, including specific references to childhood memories and family traditions that demonstrated Madison's intimate knowledge of emotional triggers that had once been effective for generating guilt and obligation. She described her prison experience as transformative, claiming to have developed genuine remorse and spiritual awareness that motivated her desire for forgiveness and relationship restoration. Marcus's support during these contact attempts was invaluable, providing objective perspective when my emotional responses threatened to override rational decision-making. His experience with his own family's manipulation tactics allowed him to recognize subtle patterns in Madison's communications that might have been less obvious to someone without similar background. Together we developed responses that maintained boundaries while documenting harassment for potential legal action if the contact attempts escalated or became threatening. The business continued expanding despite distractions related to Madison's release, with client referrals and project completions creating positive momentum that reinforced the wisdom of focusing on future opportunities rather than past traumas. Our reputation in the renewable energy community grew as word spread about our innovative financing models and customer service approach that prioritized long-term relationships over immediate sales results. The success felt especially meaningful because it was built on authentic expertise and genuine value creation rather than the performance and people-pleasing that had characterized my earlier career development. The most challenging aspect of Madison's renewed presence in my geographic area was the possibility of accidental encounters in public spaces or social situations where mutual acquaintances might expect polite interaction regardless of our complicated history. Preparing for these scenarios required specific strategies for maintaining boundaries while avoiding public scenes that could damage professional relationships or create uncomfortable situations for innocent bystanders. The key was remaining calm and confident while clearly communicating that contact was unwelcome without providing explanations that could become opportunities for manipulation. The actual encounter occurred at a Whole Foods in Central Phoenix, where Madison approached my shopping cart while I was selecting produce in the organic section. Her appearance had changed significantly since our last meeting, with professional clothing and carefully styled hair suggesting successful reintegration into mainstream society. Her greeting was friendly but cautious, testing my response before committing to more extensive interaction. My reply was polite but firm, acknowledging her presence while making clear that I had no interest in conversation or relationship rebuilding. Madison's response to my boundary maintenance was initially respectful, but her persistence in asking questions about my life and expressing desire for reconciliation revealed that her fundamental approach to relationships hadn't changed substantially during incarceration. When I declined her invitation to coffee and stated clearly that I preferred no contact, her demeanor shifted subtly toward the familiar pattern of emotional manipulation that had characterized our interactions since childhood. The attempted guilt induction was more sophisticated than before, but the underlying strategy remained unchanged. The grocery store encounter ended with me walking away while Madison continued talking, a symbolic representation of the boundary maintenance that had become central to my emotional health and personal development. The ability to prioritize my own well-being over someone else's emotional demands felt revolutionary compared to the people-pleasing reflexes that had once defined my identity. The confidence came from years of therapy, healthy relationships, and professional success that had proven my worth wasn't dependent on fixing other people's problems or absorbing responsibility for their feelings. Legal consultation about Madison's contact attempts revealed that her behavior, while unwelcome, didn't yet meet the threshold for criminal harassment charges but could potentially support a civil restraining order if the pattern continued or escalated. The attorney's advice was to document all contact attempts while maintaining clear communication about my desire for no interaction, creating a paper trail that could support legal action if Madison's behavior became more invasive or threatening. The legal framework provided reassurance that I had options for protection while reinforcing the importance of consistent boundary enforcement. The impact of maintaining boundaries with Madison extended beyond our specific relationship to influence how I approached all personal and professional interactions. The skills developed through family trauma recovery proved valuable for navigating difficult clients, managing workplace conflicts, and maintaining healthy friendships that could accommodate disagreement without threatening relationship security. The confidence that came from surviving family abandonment and rebuilding my life independently made other challenges feel manageable by comparison. Community involvement became an important aspect of personal fulfillment as our business success created opportunities for supporting causes that aligned with our values. Volunteering with organizations that provided financial literacy education to young adults felt particularly meaningful given my experience with family financial manipulation and identity theft recovery. Sharing practical knowledge about credit protection, boundary setting, and recognizing
Manipulation tactics allowed me to transform personal trauma into community service that could potentially prevent others from experiencing similar victimization. The decision to write a book about recovery from family financial abuse emerged from speaking engagements where audience responses indicated widespread need for guidance about navigating similar challenges. The writing process was therapeutic but demanding, requiring detailed examination of painful memories while maintaining focus on practical strategies for healing and prevention. The book's eventual publication by a major self-help publisher represented both personal achievement and contribution to public awareness about family-based financial crimes that were often overlooked by traditional victim services programs. Media appearances promoting the book created platforms for discussing complex topics like family loyalty versus enabling, the intersection of emotional manipulation and financial abuse, and the challenge of maintaining boundaries with family members who refuse to accept accountability for harmful behavior. The interviews were initially intimidating but became easier as I recognized the importance of speaking publicly about experiences that many people faced in private. The response from readers who shared their own stories of family betrayal and recovery confirmed the value of breaking silence about these taboo topics. The 5-year anniversary of Madison's federal sentencing passed quietly, marked only by reflection on the profound life changes that had occurred since that devastating period of discovery and family dissolution. The woman who had once defined herself through family relationships and approval-seeking had built an identity based on authentic values, healthy boundaries, and meaningful work that created genuine value rather than merely maintaining appearances. The transformation felt complete but ongoing, a process rather than a destination. Marcus and I celebrated our 3rd wedding anniversary by taking a vacation to Japan, a trip that represented everything my new life embodied, planned according to our preferences rather than family obligations. Financed through our own business success, and focused on experiences that brought genuine joy rather than social media performance. The freedom to make choices based on personal happiness rather than external expectations felt luxurious in ways that material possessions never could. Every meal, museum visit, and quiet moment together reinforced the wisdom of choosing authenticity over acceptance. The news of our parents' financial difficulties reached me through a mutual acquaintance who assumed I would want to know about their struggle to maintain the auto shop as the economy shifted toward electric vehicles and their traditional customer base declined. The information triggered complex emotions but no impulse to intervene or offer assistance, proof that the boundaries established during Madison's crisis had become permanent features of my emotional landscape. The sadness about their situation was genuine but separate from any sense of responsibility for solving problems they'd created through years of poor decisions and enabling behavior. The final test of my recovery came when Madison attempted contact through our parents, who called my business number to relay her message that she was getting married and wanted family reconciliation before the ceremony. The conversation was brief and professional, with me explaining that I had no interest in renewed contact with any family members and requesting that future communications be directed through legal representatives if necessary. The ability to maintain boundaries despite emotional manipulation attempts felt like a graduation ceremony for emotional maturity. Years of therapy had taught me that healing from family trauma wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation but about building authentic identity separate from toxic relationship patterns. The work was ongoing and required constant vigilance, but the rewards included genuine relationships, professional success, and personal peace that would have been impossible while accommodating manipulation and enabling dysfunction. The cost of freedom was high but worth paying, creating space for authentic happiness that didn't depend on other people's approval or emotional regulation. The business continued thriving as renewable energy markets expanded, and our reputation for innovative solutions attracted larger clients seeking comprehensive sustainability strategies. The work felt meaningful in ways that extended beyond financial success, contributing to environmental progress while building genuine relationships with clients who valued expertise and integrity over charm and manipulation. Each project completion and satisfied customer represented evidence that value creation was possible without emotional manipulation or boundary violations. The life Marcus and I had built together represented everything I'd once thought was impossible: partnership based on equality rather than obligation, professional success driven by authentic expertise rather than people-pleasing, and personal happiness that didn't require constant performance or emotional regulation for other people's comfort. The contrast with my family of origin was stark but no longer painful, simply evidence of different value systems and relationship approaches that were fundamentally incompatible. The story that began with devastating betrayal and family abandonment had evolved into testimony about the possibility of rebuilding authentic identity after trauma, creating meaningful relationships based on mutual respect, and finding professional fulfillment that aligned with personal values rather than external expectations. The journey required courage, therapy, and constant boundary maintenance, but the destination was worth every difficult step along the way. Standing in our Scottsdale office 5 years after Madison's crimes first came to light, surrounded by evidence of business success and authentic relationships, I felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had forced me to choose between toxic familiarity and unknown independence. The decision to prioritize truth over comfort had been terrifying but transformative, creating opportunities for genuine happiness that would have been impossible while accommodating manipulation and absorbing responsibility for other people's choices and consequences. The unexpected phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 7 years after Madison's federal conviction, while I was reviewing quarterly projections for Riley Chen Sustainable Solutions in our newly expanded office overlooking Camelback Mountain. The caller identified himself as Detective Raymond Cooper from the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, and his grave tone immediately commanded my full attention. Madison had been found dead in her apartment the previous evening, apparently from a drug overdose, and my contact information had been discovered among her personal effects as her emergency contact, despite our years of separation. The shock of Madison's death hit me in waves that were difficult to process, combining grief for the sister I'd once loved with relief that her manipulation attempts would finally end permanently. Detective Cooper explained that preliminary investigation suggested accidental overdose rather than suicide, though the distinction felt meaningless when contemplating the tragic waste of a life that had spiraled so completely out of control. Her apartment had been filled with evidence of continued financial schemes and identity theft attempts, suggesting that federal prison had failed to reform her criminal tendencies or address the underlying psychological issues that drove her destructive behavior. The detective's questions revealed that Madison had maintained detailed records of our family members' personal information, apparently planning future fraud attempts that would have targeted not only me but also extended relatives and family friends whose trust she'd previously exploited. Her death had interrupted schemes involving forged Social Security cards, fake employment documents, and elaborate credit repair scams that would have victimized vulnerable populations seeking legitimate financial assistance. The scope of her continued criminal planning was both heartbreaking and terrifying, proof that incarceration had only made her more sophisticated rather than genuinely reformed. Marcus found me in our office conference room an hour later, staring out at the desert landscape while processing the complex emotions triggered by news of Madison's death. His immediate response was protective concern about my emotional well-being, followed by practical questions about legal obligations and potential complications that might arise from being listed as Madison's emergency contact, despite our estrangement. The conversation was difficult but necessary, helping me separate genuine grief from obligation-based guilt that might otherwise have compromised my emotional stability during a vulnerable time. The funeral arrangements became a source of unexpected conflict when our parents contacted me directly for the first time in over 5 years, assuming that Madison's death would automatically restore family relationships and expecting my participation in memorial planning. Their approach was characteristically presumptuous, treating my boundary maintenance as temporary stubbornness that would naturally dissolve in the face of family tragedy, rather than recognizing it as permanent protection against toxic relationship patterns. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable, ending with my clear statement that I would not be attending funeral services or participating in family grief processes. Mom's reaction to my refusal was explosive and revealing, involving accusations of heartlessness and threats to publicly shame me for abandoning family during their darkest hour. Her inability to understand that Madison's death didn't erase years of criminal behavior and family enabling demonstrated how completely she'd failed to learn from the consequences of previous dysfunction. The call ended with her screaming about ungrateful daughters and family loyalty, while I calmly maintained boundaries that protected my emotional health from manipulation disguised as grief support. The media attention surrounding Madison's death was minimal but uncomfortable, focusing primarily on her connection to the federal identity theft case that had made local news years earlier. A brief obituary in the Arizona Republic mentioned her criminal conviction alongside flowery language about her beauty and charm, creating a sanitized version of her life that ignored the extensive damage she'd inflicted on multiple victims. The contrast between public memorial tributes and private reality illustrated how effectively manipulative people could maintain positive reputations even after their crimes became public knowledge. Legal complications arising from Madison's death included her outstanding restitution obligations to federal crime victims, debts that would now remain permanently unpaid since her estate consisted primarily of fraudulent documents and stolen property. The notification from Federal Victim Services explained that her death effectively closed all remaining criminal proceedings, ending any possibility of additional financial recovery through the legal system. The closure was both relieving and frustrating, providing finality while confirming that justice remained incomplete for many of her victims. The decision to attend Madison's funeral, despite my earlier refusal, came after extensive discussion with Marcus and Dr. Martinez, who both supported my choice to seek closure on my own terms rather than avoiding the event entirely. The plan involved arriving late, sitting in the back, and leaving immediately after the service without participating in family interactions or receiving lines. The goal was personal closure rather than family reconciliation, allowing me to say goodbye to the sister I'd once loved while maintaining boundaries that protected my emotional well-being. The funeral service at Desert View Chapel was surprisingly well attended, filled with people from Madison's various social circles who apparently remained unaware of her criminal activities or chose to overlook them in favor of fond memories from before her life deteriorated completely. The eulogies painted a picture of someone charming and vivacious, who'd simply made some poor choices, completely sanitizing the systematic criminal behavior that had defined her adult life. The disparity between public perception and private reality was striking but unsurprising given Madison's lifelong ability to present different versions of herself to different audiences. Seeing our parents at the podium delivering tearful tributes to Madison's memory while completely ignoring the victims of her crimes felt like a final confirmation that my decision to maintain separation had been correct. Their speeches focused entirely on her childhood sweetness and youthful beauty, while treating her criminal conviction as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than the predictable result of years of enabling and boundary violations. The selective memory and moral blindness that had characterized their parenting throughout our childhood remained unchanged despite overwhelming evidence of its harmful consequences.
The most difficult moment came when I noticed Tyler Brooks among the attendees, apparently paying respects to someone who'd been both romantic partner and criminal accomplice during their destructive relationship. His presence was a reminder that Madison's life had been surrounded by people who either enabled her worst impulses or actively participated in her illegal activities. The realization that her death might be mourned primarily by other criminals and enablers felt like a tragic commentary on the isolation that resulted from choosing manipulation over authentic relationship building. Leaving the funeral service without speaking to family members required significant willpower, particularly when I noticed Mom's desperate glances in my direction and Dad's obvious hope for reconciliation initiated by shared grief. The temptation to offer comfort during their pain was genuine but dangerous, likely to be interpreted as willingness to resume family relationships rather than temporary compassion for their loss. The discipline required to maintain boundaries during emotional moments represented years of therapy and personal growth that had become integral to my identity. The drive home from the funeral provided time for processing the complex emotions triggered by seeing Madison's body in the casket and confronting the finality of her death. The grief was real but complicated, mourning not the person she'd become but the sister she might have been if different choices had been made by both Madison and our parents. The sadness encompassed lost potential, wasted opportunities, and the tragic predictability of an ending that felt both shocking and inevitable given the trajectory of her life choices. Marcus's support during the days following the funeral was invaluable, providing space for grief processing while maintaining perspective about the difference between mourning someone's death and accepting responsibility for their life choices. His ability to validate my sadness while reinforcing boundary maintenance helped prevent the guilt spiral that might otherwise have compromised my emotional stability during a vulnerable period. The balance between compassion and self-protection required constant vigilance, but felt manageable with appropriate support systems in place. The unexpected inheritance notification arrived 3 weeks after Madison's funeral, revealing that she'd named me as beneficiary in a will that had been updated shortly after her release from federal prison. The estate was minimal and complicated, consisting primarily of disputed assets that were subject to ongoing legal claims from fraud victims, but it included a letter that Madison had written specifically for me to receive after her death. The decision to read the letter required careful consideration about potential emotional triggers and manipulation attempts that might extend beyond the grave. Madison's final letter was surprisingly straightforward and honest, acknowledging the pain she'd caused while avoiding the dramatic apologies and guilt induction that had characterized her previous communication attempts. She admitted that federal prison had provided clarity about the destructive patterns that had defined her adult life, but expressed doubt about her ability to maintain positive changes in the outside world where old temptations and enabling relationships remained available. The letter felt like the first genuinely authentic communication I'd received from her since childhood, making her death feel even more tragic because of the glimpse it provided of who she might have become with sustained effort and appropriate support. The most surprising element of Madison's letter was her expression of gratitude for my boundary maintenance, acknowledging that my refusal to enable her behavior had been the most loving response possible even though she'd been unable to appreciate it at the time. She wrote about recognizing the difference between support and enablement during therapy sessions in federal prison, understanding finally that my parents' willingness to excuse her behavior had actually prevented her from developing genuine accountability and personal growth. The insight felt like vindication for decisions that had been emotionally difficult but morally necessary. The letter concluded with Madison's advice for other family members dealing with similar situations, encouraging them to prioritize truth over comfort and boundaries over false peace. She specifically mentioned regretting the manipulation tactics she'd used against me and expressed hope that her death might serve as a cautionary tale for others considering similar choices. The mature perspective and genuine remorse felt like a final gift from someone who'd spent most of our relationship causing pain and chaos, providing closure that I hadn't expected to receive. The business implications of Madison's death were minimal but required attention, particularly regarding potential media coverage that might affect client relationships or professional reputation. The decision to proactively communicate with key clients about the situation felt appropriate given our commitment to transparency and ethical business practices. The response was universally supportive, with several clients expressing admiration for my handling of family challenges while maintaining professional excellence and personal integrity throughout difficult circumstances. The anniversary of Madison's death became an annual opportunity for reflection rather than mourning, marking not just her passing but the complete closure of a chapter that had shaped so much of my personal development and relationship philosophy. The date served as a reminder of how far I'd traveled from the people-pleasing, boundaryless person who'd once absorbed responsibility for everyone else's emotions and choices. The transformation felt complete but ongoing, requiring continued vigilance and intentional choice-making to maintain healthy patterns. Community speaking engagements about family financial abuse and boundary setting became more meaningful after Madison's death, allowing me to share her story as a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of enabling destructive behavior in family relationships. The presentations included practical strategies for recognizing manipulation tactics, establishing boundaries with difficult family members, and recovering from financial abuse perpetrated by trusted individuals. The audience response consistently indicated widespread need for guidance about navigating these complex situations that traditional therapy and support services often overlooked. The book's second edition, published 5 years after Madison's death, included a new chapter about processing grief and loss when estranged family members die without reconciliation or accountability. The writing process was emotionally challenging but therapeutically valuable, forcing me to examine the difference between genuine forgiveness and premature reconciliation that ignored legitimate safety concerns. The expanded edition received positive reviews from mental health professionals who appreciated the nuanced approach to family relationships that prioritized emotional health over social expectations. The most significant long-term impact of Madison's death was the deepened appreciation for authentic relationships and genuine personal growth that characterized my current life. Every interaction with Marcus, every successful business project, and every meaningful friendship felt more precious because of the contrast with the manipulation and dysfunction that had once defined my family relationships. The gratitude extended beyond personal circumstances to include professional opportunities and community connections that would have been impossible while managing constant family crises. The decision to establish a scholarship fund in Madison's memory for young adults aging out of foster care represented a way to honor her potential while supporting people who might be vulnerable to similar exploitation and manipulation. The scholarship criteria emphasized financial literacy education, boundary setting skills, and support for transitioning to independent living without family resources. The program felt like a meaningful way to transform personal tragedy into community benefit while maintaining appropriate emotional distance from Madison's actual choices and consequences. 10 years after Madison's initial crimes and 3 years after her death, the life Marcus and I had built represented everything I'd once thought was impossible for someone from my family background. The business had expanded to include renewable energy projects across multiple states, our marriage had deepened through shared challenges and mutual support, and our community involvement had created meaningful relationships based on shared values rather than obligation or guilt. The success felt sustainable because it was built on authentic foundations rather than performance and people-pleasing. The final test of my recovery came when our parents attempted contact through attorneys after developing serious health problems that required family assistance they couldn't afford independently. The request for reconciliation was framed in terms of forgiveness and Christian duty, suggesting that their medical needs should override years of boundary maintenance and unresolved conflict about enabling Madison's destructive behavior. The response through my own attorney was compassionate but firm, offering to contribute to their medical expenses through third-party administration while maintaining no direct contact or relationship restoration. The piece that accompanied this final boundary enforcement confirmed that healing from family trauma had been complete rather than temporary, creating permanent changes in identity and relationship capacity that would protect me from future manipulation attempts regardless of circumstances or emotional appeals. The ability to respond to genuine need without sacrificing personal safety or emotional well-being represented the ultimate victory over patterns that had once defined my entire existence. The boundaries had become natural rather than effortful, evidence of authentic transformation rather than temporary coping strategies. Looking back on the journey from financial victim to successful entrepreneur, from family scapegoat to independent adult, and from people pleaser to boundary setter, I felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had forced me to choose between toxic familiarity and unknown independence. Madison's crimes had been devastating and inexcusable, but they'd also been liberating, creating the necessity for personal growth that might otherwise have remained postponed indefinitely. The transformation had required courage, therapy, and constant vigilance, but the destination was worth every difficult step along the way. The story that began with devastating betrayal had evolved into testimony about resilience, the possibility of rebuilding authentic identity after trauma, and the importance of choosing truth over comfort in family relationships. The lessons learned through personal experience had become tools for helping others navigate similar challenges while building the kind of life that reflected genuine values rather than external expectations. The journey continued daily through intentional choices that prioritized emotional health, authentic relationships, and meaningful work that created value rather than merely maintaining appearances. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.